Okay, I see it is 101, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the post-disaster recovery process. And this is a different focus from the more recent presentation we gave on local official responsibilities before and after floods and focusing on substantial damage. Today we'll be focusing more on that FEMA disaster process and where our Minnesota Homeland Security Emergency Management folks fit in, where locals fit in, and just trying to understand some of the acronyms in that process today. So I'm Ceil Strauss, I'm the State Floodplain Manager, and I'll be one of the presenters. And Brian Killen with FEMA, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I am the Minnesota contact at FEMA Region 5 in the Floodplain Management Insurance Branch. So I work with Ceil on floodplain management, National Flood Insurance Program items and issues in Minnesota. I also work in Michigan as well and manage one of our executive orders,
Federal Flood Risk Management Standards.
Yes, I do all those things, but nice to be here. Thank you.
So thanks for joining us. And Gary Bennett, my coworker, is handling the logistics, and you should be able to see our chat. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and use the chat and put comments in there. Since it's a fairly small group, you could also come off mute and ask questions if you're having trouble getting things into chat. But some of the topics we'll talk about are what are the triggers for getting a federal disaster declaration or a state declaration, since we have the unique situation where we have state declarations. We'll talk a little bit more about public assistance, individual assistance a little less, and then some of our longer term recovery programs like the FEMA grants and the Minnesota grant programs, and end with a little bit about the flood insurance side of things for recovery. This is all pretty high level. We'll be giving a lot of references to resources to look at in more depth, but the goal here was helping you to understand the big picture and where some of these different terms and folks fit in. And I'll continue then with the slides here, but right off the bat, wanted to talk about who some of the key players are. FEMA is definitely involved, and it's actually folks out of Region 5 like Brian and others. Some are temporary staff or reservists. There's disaster staff out of FEMA headquarters that get involved, and you're really getting into the weeds figuring out where some of these different FEMA folks or their contractors are in the hierarchy, but we'll probably just be referring to them as or FEMA contractors throughout this presentation. At the state level, our Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management, HSEM, and they're in the Department of Public Safety. So they are really the lead on most of the things that are happening post-disaster when there is when there is a federal disaster declared. DNR will get involved in a support role, and we've got separate emergency management staff who, as local officials do in working with FEMA for damages to our own DNR facilities, which often is the case. And our area hydrologists also support in those efforts. But the local level, the county and the cities, the emergency managers, especially the county emergency managers, are very involved in the process and the follow-up. So overall, the recovery programs are the Public Assistance Program, or PA, and we'll be talking about that first, getting into a little bit more depth, but we do have some links in here, and by the way, I will be sending out PDFs of these slides so that you can use the links that are embedded here and not try and take a bunch of notes. But then also a lot of the resources we'll have linked in here, in addition to some of these main pages that we've got linked. We'll talk a little bit about individual assistance, just to give you an idea of what it involves. We don't see that very often in Minnesota, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we want you to at least be aware. And the Hazard Mitigation Assistance, that's those grants, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance grants programs, and we'll talk a little bit about that more toward the end. So public assistance, that's FEMA's program that provides supplemental grants to the state and to tribal governments and local governments, usually as the applicants under the state and the tribes, and get resources to communities fairly quickly, both in the emergency phase and then in the longer term recovery phase of the program. And we'll get into those categories. So, but FEMA will provide help and reimburse costs for some of these categories, like the debris removal, the emergency response kinds of measures that are going on during these bigger floods. And then the longer term recovery is restoring that public infrastructure, restoring the culverts and the bridges and the roads and the utilities and some of those kinds of things. And then the longer effort is some of the grants and helping with longer term recovery and trying to prevent that damage from happening again. And a lot of what we'll be talking about is in this public assistance program and policy guide. We do have a couple slides with links to that, but we're trying to take some of the information in that document and get it into digestible bites here as we're going through this presentation today. For the public assistance grant funding, there are 4 components of eligibility. The applicant does have to be a state, territory, tribe, local government, or certain private nonprofit organizations. And like this, a lot of these things you might need to get into the details to know more about those nonprofit organizations if you're involved with one that wants to know if they'd be eligible. When we're talking about facilities, that's buildings, the public works systems, equipment or natural feature. I'm not sure what natural feature means. Brian, do you have a input on that?
That's a good question. Natural feature, I'd have to look it up real
That's
quick.
like a landslide or bluffs, where the road slides. I don't know. That's
Maybe
something
levy. I'm not sure, but while we're talking, I can look it up in the policy guide and see what they mean
what
by
that
that.
means.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, in terms of the work, they're looking, like I said, emergency or permanent, and it's got to be related to that declared incident, that it's responding to that incident or repairing damage due to that incident is what they're funding. And the cost that's being reimbursed or you can get grants for later is tied to eligible work. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on what's eligible work. But it does point out it includes labor, equipment, materials, contract work, and some of the direct and indirect administrative costs. So it's pretty broad that way. But emergency work, they break things into categories. And the emergency work is categories A and B. The A is that debris removal. Debris from the flooding that needs to be removed, and there's usually a lot of that. Emergency protective measures, there's a lot of work in blocking off roads, sometimes putting up temporary dikes and all kinds of measures that there at the time of the flooding. The permanent work, here we're looking at repair of these systems that got damaged. And the big ones that we see are road systems, repairing roads, replacing burst culverts, bridges, those kinds of things. We don't see a lot of public buildings that get damaged because luckily we don't have that many public buildings in the higher risk areas. A lot of public utility systems though, and as I mentioned, the parks and other facilities, certainly we see damage to the DNR facilities, our parks and trail facilities. And we do have this nice link here. I'll have a separate slide later showing a little bit more detail on that. We also want to mention that there's this 1206 authorization. That's a newer thing. That's funding during the disasters to help get reimbursed for bringing on folks to help with code administration. that sometimes it's such a big flood and you've got a whole bunch of permits and you're reviewing what they want to do, especially for individual assistance. When we start talking about individual assistance, residential business buildings are being impacted, and you can get some funding to bring in folks to help with that and help pay some of those costs, or even to add code enforcement to work on the adoption process at the local level of building code and some things like that. That's a whole separate discussion. We can, if you're interested in those, or when we do have a bigger disaster, we'll certainly get out reminders about being able to apply for that. I know we've had a couple of articles in Water Talk talking about the 1206 process, and at least one of the articles we had a link to a little video that was pretty informative. One of the big questions is, how does it get declared a disaster? Is it a big enough disaster that it is beyond local capability? And for that, each of the states has a threshold that you usually need to meet before you can ask for the federal disaster to be considered. In Minnesota, that is currently 10.5 million is the trigger from statewide perspective. And again, this is for this federal fiscal year. It does change each fiscal year. And then the counties that get included, there's a separate county trigger. And I've got, this is from a 2-pager that Homeland Security Emergency Management has on their page. They update this every fiscal year. So I know this print is tiny, but I wanted to be able to point out that, yeah, each county's got a trigger. So if you're not familiar with what it is in your county, you can use that link and see what that is. If that trigger is met for the state level, then the governor, in our case, would make a formal request to FEMA for a presidential declaration. And FEMA would review that request and determine whether that presidential declaration is going to be made. And again, I've got a link to this 2-pager. The first page actually is kind of nice, talking about some of the main steps and the kinds of things that you can get covered. And then also just the overall disaster recovery page for Homeland Security Emergency Management. They've got the links to this year's, and then for future years, if you're going back after September 30th and want to see the latest, it'll be on that page, and some other links to useful information. And then FEMA's got a site on how a disaster gets declared if you want to know more about the details. And I was just pointing out that the top here in that info sheet, it does point out since 2014, the state legislature did adopt some ways to fund the local share for the federal disasters when we have them, that the legislation says that we're going to cover the full FEMA match. And it's usually 75% FEMA, 25% local. So if there's a declaration, then that state fund will cover that local share. We have a unique thing too that started in 2014 with that legislation, that maybe it's a big flood, but it wasn't quite big enough to get a federal designation. Now, if it meets 50% of that federal threshold, so now we're talking a little over 5 million statewide, that we have a state declaration process and funding to help the local units of government. They would still be responsible for 25% of the eligible costs, but the state's helping with a big portion of that cost and making things easier for locals to bring things back after a disaster and be able to get their roads and their utilities and everything else functioning again and help their citizens. The last federal disaster that we had was just last year, that we had an incident with severe storms and flooding in April last year. We did have public assistance categories A through G declared, and you'll see it took a few months to get the actual declaration. So the storm was in April. It got officially declared in July, and this is not unusual to see this kind of a lag. It takes a little while to go through the process and verify what the damages were and if it meets those thresholds and go through that official declaration process. FEMA does have a short little video about how a disaster gets declared. So I've got the link for that here. And if you want to see more about past disasters in Minnesota, you can use this link on to the FEMA page. You can select the state and you can note a time period if you want to go back and see everything, or if you just want to look in more recent years and see what kinds of disasters we've had over time. But every county in the state has had several disaster declarations that involve flooding over the last 20, 30 years at least. Back to these categories we talked about, the first couple categories is the emergency work. And I'm repeating this partly because I want to point out that the emergency work, that all communities are eligible to get that. And if we have a declaration. Permanent work though, the repair, the assistance in covering the costs of repairs to roads, bridges, water control facilities, public buildings, public utilities, parks, and other related recreation facilities. The community needs to be an NFIP, a National Flood Insurance Program participating community. 96% of the population lives in communities that participate. All of our counties that have zoning, so that's most of the counties in the state, they're all participating. But we do have a couple hundred communities that are not participating. They tend to be smaller communities, but we're encouraging them to get in the program. So they're able to get some of this kind of assistance and make flood insurance available to citizens in their communities. Let's go to the next slide. That's what is at this link, is a nice listing, a little bit more detail of what kinds of examples of things are in these different categories that our Homeland Security emergency management folks have put together. So a little bit more about what's considered debris removal. What are some of the protective services that could be eligible? What kinds of road and bridge work and other details like that. So this is a nice handy summary of the kinds of eligible projects that could be considered projects that get reimbursement through the process. How does the process of determining whether we're eligible work? Well, they have something called preliminary damage assessments. They're usually done for the public assistance separate from individual assistance. So the public assistance, they're looking at those public facilities, those categories we were just looking at. What damage was there to the roads and bridges and culverts, to the public buildings and those kinds of things. The leads here are our staff with the Homeland Security Emergency Management Division and FEMA. And some of the bigger floods, we'll have Department of Health and maybe DNR's helping, but these are the big players, would be Homeland Security Emergency Management and FEMA. Sometimes we'll have a big enough flood that we're looking at preliminary damage assessments for individual assistance. Individual assistance is aid for residences and businesses, so for not public facilities. And then in some of the really big floods, you'll see the American Red Cross and other volunteer organizations out there doing related inspections and assessments. They're definitely big players when we get into the really big floods. And when do they start these preliminary damage assessments? Well, here I'm trying to show the fish flopping on the couch. And that's one of my counterparts who's retired now, but he liked to talk about, you got to get out there while the fish are still flopping on the couch. They do get out there as soon as they can safely to look at. There's a lot of different inspections going on. The preliminary damage assessments would be going on again for the bigger potential floods. But at the same time, we've got health and safety people looking at, is this building safe to enter? Is it habitable or not? The assessor's office is out there looking at the percentage of damage. As we've talked about in other presentations, our local zoning folks need to be determining if buildings were substantially damaged. And if they weren't substantially damaged, if they need repair permits or permits for doing the maintenance repair after a flood, those who have insurance, you've got the adjusters out there. So lots of different folks out there doing inspections. And FEMA did put this info sheet together a few years ago. It's something that you could share with your citizens if they're seeing a lot of different folks out there showing the different kinds of things that they might be looking at, either the insurance industry, the government for some of the things I just mentioned, and others who might be out there looking. Here's an example of some folks that are out there doing the inspections, and they need to get out there while there's still the evidence to look at. There's the damage, there's the water lines. You can see how high the water got. This would have been inspections for individual assistance for buildings and businesses, but they're also out there looking at that public assistance eligible work, the roads, the culverts, the bridges, the utilities, public buildings, and looking at many of the same things that they're looking at here for the homes with the public buildings. Here's an overall process that FEMA has in their guidebook that I mentioned at the beginning. And we're going to break this up and look at this bit by bit here, but they've got this overall process graphic, which is kind of helpful. So the first part of this is after they've made the determination that there's a presidential declaration, then they have applicant briefings. And the state is considered the recipient of the declaration. And again, our state main contact for that is Homeland Security Emergency Management. They conduct applicant briefings. And in more recent years, many more of those have been virtual. In the past, they were in person, usually at the county level. And they are led, again, by Homeland Security Emergency Management. And they determine, are they going to be done in person? Are they going to cluster by county? Are they going to have a couple counties maybe that they'll present together? They make those decisions, and they definitely keep emergency managers in those affected areas in the loop and reach out to them and let them know about these applicant briefings. In the applicant briefings, they talk about what kinds of things are eligible for assistance. What do they need to do to make the request for assistance? So that next step is that the applicants are going to be the cities, the counties, and those groups of nonprofits and others that are potentially eligible for some of the assistance. But they do have to apply within 30 days of the declaration. They have these applicant briefings pretty quick after the declaration's made because they do need to help the communities to get their requests in within that 30-day period there. Then the state would coordinate with FEMA to get the requested projects into a FEMA portal, into a grant portal, basically. The applicant eligibility is reviewed by FEMA, assigns a case manager for the different projects, and they do the review. And once that FEMA case manager has approved it, they'll schedule these exploratory calls. The eligible applicants, cities, counties, townships, mainly the units of government because it's public facilities that we're looking at that are eligible for the assistance. Also wanted to note that tribes can choose to be recipient, like the program coordinator, the same as the state, or to be an applicant. The next step is that there's these recovery scoping meetings that the FEMA case manager and FEMA public assistance staff basically take over at this point, and they oversee the next steps. So the next phase is that the applicant is identifying and reporting that damage within 60 days of the recovery scoping meetings. The FEMA caseworkers are going to group damages into projects. They're going to arrange site inspections. Usually it's FEMA contractors or FEMA staff, and sometimes the contractors include the Corps of Engineers, but they're out there doing inspections with the applicants to figure out what is the damage, what's eligible to get assistance, and getting that into the right format to submit to FEMA for reimbursement. And then it goes to the Consolidated Resource Center, the CRC, which is kind of a centralized case center where FEMA contractors collect the details and do reviews, put together statements of work and cost estimates, and then those are reviewed by other staff. Again, it gets into the weeds trying to figure out who's doing what at what steps, and that document we mentioned at the beginning does get into more detail, but just hoping that giving an idea of some of the steps in the process helps you to realize what all the different things that applicants need to go through. Then we're getting to the phase 4 where FEMA and the recipient are looking at the final project reviews. They put together that scope of work and the costs. FEMA staff are verifying that they may meet some of the environmental and historical preservation requirements. And they're also looking at whether they've gotten the permits that they're supposed to be getting along the way, whether DNR permits or other local permits are required. That's part of the environmental review. They're usually looking to make sure that it meets your floodplain ordinance, the local floodplain ordinance, whatever is being proposed. FEMA's verifying some of these cost shares and other reviews, but they do, of course, bring in the recipient for a final review after FEMA's putting together information. And then phase 5, obligation of funds. So they're actually getting the funds obligated to go to that local unit of government who wants to do the repairs and the recovery, and having a recovery transition meeting. Then the FEMA caseworkers are coordinating with the applicants, getting quarterly reports in, that if there are any changes to that statement of work, they're working with that local unit of government. And I see we're getting some comments in here. Brian was finding what natural features are. Brian, you want to maybe mention that?
Yeah, so a big focus of PA is facilities. So we're really focused on public facilities. So to broaden that, they define facility as a building, the system, or equipment built or manufactured or improved or maintained natural feature. So it's really, they've added that natural feature element, but to be eligible, it has to be an improved or maintained natural feature. The examples they gave were a terrace slope or realigned channel, but then someone else mentioned constructed wetlands or maybe stormwater ponds or stabilized stream banks. And I think, again, it has 3 conditions that it has to meet, and I put those in the chat.
Okay, thanks for looking that up.
Sure. Yeah, so our policy guide will never list every single scenario, but it'll list the conditions usually, and then your case manager will take a look at the thing that had damage and potentially is eligible for reimbursement and make that decision with the applicant.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
that's helpful. Sure. Then we get into the final reconciliation and making sure that the project was done as was agreed upon. I do know that some of the, especially townships, when they're trying to collect that final amount for the reimbursement, sometimes they're looking at after the fact permits because they missed some steps earlier in the process. But there are lots of checks and balances as part of the process. So at a high level, just a reminder for communities that the applicant briefings, that's going to happen really soon after the declaration. That's something where the state, the recipient, so officially what they're called, will give the high level information on how to go through that PA program and submit projects, talk about what's eligible, talk about how to do that application. And the recovery scoping meetings, again, an important part in the process. And they provide this information for the potential applicants, and then the site inspections, both before the work is done, showing what the damage was, and then once the work is done, documenting that the work was done that was proposed. And one other aspect that's a separate part but related is what we call the mitigation program, the Section 406. And that is additional potential funding that there's many times that we don't want to just be putting things back the way they were. They've been destroyed over and over again, and we want to make improvements so that those things don't get destroyed again in the next flood. It is kind of complicated, but it is something that we really encourage communities to look at, especially the culverts or road crossings, the roads that get damaged over and over again. What can possibly be done to improve it so it doesn't get blown out in the next similar level flood? And in the Public Assistance Program policy guide that I've been noting, in the appendix, it gets into more detail about the kinds of things you can be doing. And here's some examples, flood mitigation examples. Upsizing culverts, getting the wing walls or riprap so that it's not eroding as much. In non-residential buildings, so, and these would be public buildings, that some of the dry floodproofing options might be there, or the wet floodproofing options might be there so that the next flood you don't have as much damage repair to do. Elevating buildings and equipment, certainly elevating the utilities, and again, preventing damages in general. Here's an example of a flood wall going in. And here's some other mitigation examples for wind, which we certainly do see wind damage and tornadoes in Minnesota, but some of the eligible kinds of categories that they see for mitigating. Again, they call it the Section 406 program, and there's factors of how much increased costs there is that will be covered by this process. And there is still the local cost share, but we really want to encourage communities to consider these other options. So here's another slide we had before. Does it really make sense to replace in kind when that existing culvert is getting blown out every time? And if the county got a public assistance declaration, we encourage them to be looking at that. And in particular, this Appendix J, they get into some of the specifics. One of them that they mention is what they call a relief culvert to give additional capacity at these road crossings. And that's basically what we call our floodplain culverts in Minnesota. And we've had other separate trainings about this, but I do want to point out that we do have a separate page. They call it the geomorphic approach on that page, but basically here's your main crossing. They might have made that a little bit bigger, but there's also some other culverts here to provide relief in the wider part of the floodplain and have flow not all going through one spot. And we do have a cost share program right now. We've got funding in particular to help cost share the additional costs of putting in these floodplain culverts, the cost beyond just the in-kind replacement. So here's a link to the geomorphic approach site and one to the announcement for our cost share grants. On our recordings of past trainings, Salam Murtada and I did a training a year ago. That recording's on there. That was more about what floodplain culverts are and the kind of situations where it makes sense. And Salam did an update of that this year. We don't have it in our recordings yet, but we expect it to be there anytime. We asked our folks who upload things to YouTube to do that a couple weeks ago. So we're hoping to have that available soon. And this year, we got much more into the new cost share grants and how that process will work. Some other things I want to mention is that there's other federal and state requirements to remember, and they get woven into different steps of the FEMA PA process. But if there's public buildings that are in the 100-year area, the special flood hazard area, that 100-year mapped floodplain, there's the federal flood risk management standards. And a lot of those standards, they're still going through getting more detailed rules and guidance. But one part that is applying now is that structures in the floodplain have to meet that now if there's a new disaster. And Brian, I can't remember, that was like March. It's sometime recently that any disasters going forward, public buildings that are getting public assistance have to meet these federal flood risk management standards.
No, March was the changeover in individual assistance.
Individual assistance? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So FFRMS has been in place for some programs since fiscal year 21. Yeah, it applies to any new public assistance disaster, including last year's.
That's right, because last year we did have a public facility that was impacted, one of the DOT facilities.
But like you said, it's only partially implemented until we complete our rulemaking.
Okay. So, but the buildings part is the part that's being implemented.
Right.
And in the future, there'll be others.
It'll potentially expand the horizontal floodplain. It's unknown if it's going to affect anything other than vertical buildings right now, like linear features or something like that, or linear infrastructure. We're not sure yet. We'll have to do additional policy.
Okay. But they'll
based on
basically be taking that, like that 2-foot freeboard and extending that out, and the additional horizontal area that's impacted in the future would also be
right. And because that doesn't
impacted.
exist in statute, we have to do that through rulemaking. So right now we can only apply the freeboard to the special flood hazard area, adding the vertical component of mitigation for any federally funded federal project.
Including the public assistance.
Yeah, public assistance and any grants, any federal grants.
Okay. And if it's a critical facility, so that would be operation centers, police, fire, critical utilities.
Energy,
oh,
right.
Yeah, those are good examples. That those have a higher freeboard. And don't they have to be either be above the 500-year or the 3-foot?
They're located spatially. If they're in the 500-year, then they have to look at whatever's higher, 500-year elevation or 3-foot freeboard, and they take whatever's higher. If there's no 500-year, then default back to the freeboard. But they're saying that non-critical facilities, you only can look at the special flood hazard area, whereas critical facilities, you can actually look at the 500-year to include them in this policy.
Yeah, so definitely looking at some of those when we do have either the grants or the public assistance is something to be aware of. That there'll be more coming out about the federal flood risk management standards in the future. And then I just was reminding that the state and local requirements, that there might be a public water work permit required if it involves a public water. So we're reminding folks to earlier in the process be checking with their DNR area hydrologist on whether they need a DNR permit. And if it's within the FEMA mapped area, then even if they don't need a DNR permit, there's got to be a permit issued. That's one of the requirements of your local ordinances. So at the local level, you will need to issue a permit if there's not a DNR permit and the project is in the mapped floodplain. And again, that's something some of the communities have been finding out toward the end, and we're hoping to do a better job of looking at that earlier in the review process. When we're talking about the DNR permits, we do have a repair of flood damages, a general permit to help speed up the process. We do have links to that on our website. So if there is a federal disaster declaration or state disaster declaration, it's automatically kicked in and becomes a valid general permit in effect. And then also our regional managers can say, this is a big flood. We're going to say that the general permit for repair flood damage is in effect. But again, you'll be working with your area hydrologists on the permitting. But if it's something covered by this general permit, it helps make it a faster, smoother process. But even though it might be faster and easier to do an in-kind replacement, sometimes that's not the best alternatives. We do like to remind folks. So moving on, we did want to spend a little bit of time talking about individual assistance. And as I mentioned earlier, that's when we're talking about non-public things, the residential buildings, businesses. There's different kinds of programs there. And Brian, did you want to maybe jump in and talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, so I know Ceil was saying we don't see individual assistance too much in Minnesota, not in the recent past that I can remember, but individual assistance is designed to provide individual survivors, households, some type of benefit to supplement their insurance, supplement other programs that voluntary organizations that maybe their support the recovery process. So you can see here, well, we recently changed quite a bit of our program delivery for individual assistance to make it easier. I think in the previous slide, we mentioned SBA, which is Small Business Administration. There was a convoluted process where disaster survivors would have to apply for a loan before they can even fully get individual assistance. But anyway, we've streamlined that. That's what the bottom of this slide highlights a little bit. So there are 4 main categories. There's initial assistance, crisis. Is there sheltering needed? Professional support, legal services and case management. The big one is housing. So lodging, rental assistance. Are there repairs needed? Even down to when they do preliminary damage assessments, they also will follow up that with inspections as well, just like for public assistance. We'll go back and inspect a home, maybe more than once to really determine, because people can appeal their grant for individual assistance. I know that sounds terrible for a survivor to do that, but disasters can maximize. I think the limit for individual assistance is almost 40,000 as a direct grant from FEMA. But anyway, the housing mission is key to that. Home repairs. What I was saying before is, say your furnace is damaged or your water heater. What does FEMA need to reimburse or know was damaged to make the home safe, sanitary, and functional? We're not trying to replace insurance and make the home fully repaired, but we're trying to provide enough to make the home livable again and functional. So that's why you see home repair, home replacement. And the last one, other needs assistance, is a separate program, but you can see here, we've added serious needs and displacement. You had to do a lot of assessments before, even for a disaster survivor to get any assistance. So serious needs kind of quickly categorizes the level of need and says, okay, every person in the disaster is going to get $750 to start off with, and then they, will go through and do the full disaster survivor application and figure out what else they need, ranging from these services. But as you can see from COVID, another one that came out was funeral assistance too. So there's lots of things that FEMA will cover under the individual assistance program. And this is just a bit about the reforms that took place. So again, I mentioned that serious needs assistance, creating displacement assistance. So if you're actually displaced, what kind of services support would you need for that? And then another big one is cutting red tape and streamlining the application process.
Bottom line, they were trying to make things more simplified process and get rid of that extra red tape.
Right. So that was a major change for individual assistance. So those are in effect as of March 22nd, these changes you're seeing here.
So any future declarations that involve individual assistance, hopefully things will be easier for folks. And again, that's not very common in Minnesota. We had individual assistance in Waseca in 2016, but otherwise in the last 20 years, we haven't seen it. But we just want you to be aware of that. One thing that we do use a lot and see is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's normally 75-25 federal, non-federal cost share. Basically, they look at the total damage amount based on the preliminary damage assessments and come up with an initial estimated amount. But then the final amount can take up to a year to confirm as they get better ideas of what the actual levels of damage are. The nice thing about this program is those are grants that are available statewide, so not just in the declared counties. So some of our communities that have plans and they've got things in place that, hey, as soon as we get money, this is the next thing we're going to do to protect our community and reduce risk, that this money does become available when there's been a disaster that's federally declared in the state. And this gives you an idea of some of the other grant programs. Again, we're not going to get into detail on these. That's a whole separate training, but just being aware that there are a bunch of different programs, including the HMGP program. And this chart I'm just showing mainly to show that there's different requirements of when they get triggered and who's eligible. And you do need your hazard mitigation plans up to date, your county level. All hazard mitigation plans. You'll see the yeses there for all those grants. And some of the grants are only open to communities, to applicants that are in communities that are NFIP participating communities, and a lot of other details.
And see, I would add, I think the one is the second row where it says competitive question mark.
Okay.
These are a mix. These are all of our grants in one table, but some of them are non-disaster, meaning they're triggered if you get a federally declared disaster. Some of them, though, however, are competitive, like BRIC, FMA Swift Current. Those are competitive nationally, or some of them are actually pre-disaster. The PDM one is basically congressional directed appropriations. So specific projects are funded directly by Congress. So
we don't see a lot of those that are nationally competitive. We tend to not do as well as other states have greater needs and come out higher. So it's nice to have some that are not nationally competitive.
And one even at the end, the revolving loan is a loan fund that can help communities or states have a pot of money that they can loan out at any time. It doesn't matter. It's not competitive or based on their disaster.
And we haven't done a very good job of getting information out about that option. That's something we should do here in the future.
And that would be up to the state too. Yeah, the state would have to apply to FEMA to initiate that.
So you can see more information about these, but this summarizes some of the things that we were just talking about, that the applicants do need to be states, tribes, territories. Communities are officially considered sub-applicants or sub-grantees, so they're eligible. You do have to have that FEMA-approved mitigation plan at your county or in your community. The cost share, we mentioned the 75% federal, 25% non-federal. Let's see, other details would be in this document here. So here's some more resources about these grants. And again, they'll be in the slides that we send out afterward. But I also need to mention our state program. We've got a really nice state grant program, flood hazard mitigation program. I'm seeing a lot of names of folks here who I know are familiar with that program, but I've got a link here to our main page, which looks like this. I will mention we've got a new document on the grant prioritization guidelines showing the statutes that apply, the rule language that applies. Also, that pretty often we're able to use the state grants to help pay half of the non-federal cost share on those FEMA grants, that 25%. So a lot of times our federal grants can pay 12.5% of that cost. And just mentioning that Matt Bauman is now our contact for this program, that Pat Ledge did retire, and Matt's the new Pat. Minnesota Recovers Task Force gets stood up if it's a really big flood. It's something that got created after the really big 1997 floods. And it's a way that we get our state and federal agencies working together along with the volunteer agencies. We have coordination meetings. We've got different subgroups that will review the different applications for aid and helping to be a one-stop shop for communities to get the kind of aid that's available in the state. And final just reminder of increased cost of compliance, that those who have a flood insurance policy, if they're substantially damaged, then they're eligible to get kind of a rider on their flood insurance for up to $30,000 to do flood proofing if they're a non-residential building, otherwise to relocate on another part of the property or outside the floodplain, to elevate, or the cost of demolishing the building. So Fred tells you what's available. And administrators do need to look at the building and do an official determination that it's been substantially damaged, and based on the cost to bring the structure into compliance with the local ordinance. So in our resources we've got available online, our playbook for substantial damage, we've got a sample letter and some more detail. And here's just an example of a property that got ICC money. They were flooded. This happens to be in Illinois on the Mississippi River, I believe. And so they did use ICC money to elevate the building and have that wet flood-proof parking on the lower level, but get their habitable level elevated using ICC funds. And if there's wording in your ordinance, then there's this language here that if you've got a flood-related damage 2 times within a 10-year period and the average damage is over 25%, so putting 2 situations together is over the 50%, then they can also get that up to $30,000 to make that building compliant and reduce their future risk. But that language has to be in the ordinance. It's been in our model ordinance for about 10 years. And I know that we've got at least one community that just adopted it after they had someone get a smaller amount of damage. They've had a couple times. And now in the future, they'll be eligible if they get damage again within that 10-year period. Also, one final point about there are cases where that ICC claim money can go toward a community flood reduction project, and that gets complicated. So I've got a link here to the answers about the FAQs with ICC, and there's a whole section on using the ICC with FEMA mitigation grants. And I just clipped the table of contents there to show the kinds of things that they are looking at. So if buildings are getting bought out and they had flood insurance, that's something that's a way to help pay that local community share of the grants. And a few more resources that we've been mentioning or that are related to what we've been talking about. And ending here right at 2:00. I do have our contact information on this last slide. So that is what I had in my presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.